Welcome back. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt overlooked at work even when you knew you were carrying more than your share? Stories like this matter, and if you've ever learned something from real workplace experiences, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. For months, I quietly became the person everyone depended on without anyone really saying it out loud. I was the one who fixed reports before deadlines slipped, calmed clients when they were on the verge of leaving, and caught small mistakes before they turned into expensive problems. My name wasn't the one mentioned in meetings, but my work was always there, holding everything together. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself results mattered more than recognition. But I started noticing a pattern. Every time I solved something complicated, my boss would be the one presenting the solution. Every time a project succeeded, he spoke like it had been a team effort, even when I knew who had stayed late to make it work. Then one morning, I opened my calendar and noticed I had been removed from a meeting I had helped prepare for. It wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't the last time it would happen. The first time I noticed I'd been removed from a meeting, I assumed it was a simple oversight. Calendars got messy, especially during busy weeks. But when it happened again the next day, and then again 2 days later, I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. These weren't random team check-ins either. These were meetings tied directly to projects I was leading behind the scenes. I opened the meeting history and saw the pattern clearly. My name had been there at one point. Then it was quietly removed. No explanation. No message. Just gone. What made it stranger was that the reports I'd prepared for those meetings were still being used. I could see them attached in the shared folders, my formatting untouched, my data still front and center. Only now, the presentation notes had been edited slightly, and my boss's name was listed as the presenter. I tried to brush it off. Office politics happened. People stepped in and out of roles all the time. But the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. Later that afternoon, while reviewing access permissions for a file, I noticed something else. A few of my editing rights had quietly changed to view only. No one had mentioned it. No one had warned me. And HR was suddenly copied on an email thread about department restructuring. I spent the next few days watching more carefully, not saying anything yet. If something was changing, I wanted to understand what it was before reacting. I focused on my work, making sure nothing slipped, especially with one of our biggest clients who was already frustrated over delayed deliverables. Late one evening, I caught a discrepancy in one of their contract structures. It was buried deep, a small detail that would have caused major issues in billing if it went unnoticed. I stayed late, fixed it, and flagged it internally so it could be addressed before it became a problem. 2 days later, the client sent a message praising the company for catching the issue so quickly. They said it saved them from a serious financial headache. I felt a quiet sense of relief reading it. But when the weekly team update rolled around, my boss presented the situation like he had personally stepped in and resolved it. He spoke confidently, walking everyone through the solution using the exact notes I had written. No mention of my name. No acknowledgement at all. I sat there, listening, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest. Then, just before the meeting ended, a new calendar notification popped up on my screen. HR check-in tomorrow morning. I walked into the HR office expecting a conversation, maybe a discussion about shifting roles or the restructuring I'd seen mentioned in emails. I told myself not to overthink it. Companies reorganized all the time. Maybe this was just a formality. The room felt strangely quiet when I stepped in. A woman from HR sat across from me with a folder already open on the table. My boss wasn't there. That was the first thing that felt off. She gave me a tight, rehearsed smile and got straight to the point. Laura, thank you for coming in. Due to organizational restructuring, your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. Eliminated? I repeated, the word feeling unfamiliar in my mouth. She nodded, already sliding a document across the table. Severance details. Final pay. Benefits timeline. It was all prepared in advance, like this decision had been made long before I ever walked in. There's no performance issue, she added quickly. This is purely structural. I glanced at the door, half expecting my boss to walk in and explain, but it stayed closed. "Your system access will be disabled within the hour," she continued. "We'll give you time to collect your things." The meeting was over before it even felt like it started. Walking back to my desk felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's day instead of my own. The office looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Phones ringing. People typing. Conversations in low voices. But everything felt distant, muted somehow. I started packing quietly, not wanting attention. A few coworkers noticed, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding in seconds. No one said much, but the looks they gave me told me something I hadn't expected. They already knew. One of the newer team members passed by and paused just long enough to whisper, "I'm really sorry," before walking off quickly, like even being seen talking to me might be risky. I kept putting things into my bag, trying to keep my hands steady. I glanced toward my boss's office. His door was shut. The blinds were slightly tilted, but I could see the light was on. He was inside. He knew I was leaving. He never came out. No handshake. No explanation. Not even a goodbye. As I walked past reception, carrying the last of my things, I felt the weight of something I couldn't quite name yet. This hadn't felt sudden to everyone else. Just to me. The first 2 days after I left felt strangely quiet. My phone wasn't ringing, my inbox stayed still, and for the first time in years, there was nothing urgent pulling at my attention. I kept expecting the shock to wear off, for some kind of explanation to arrive, but it never came. Instead, I found myself opening old folders on my personal laptop, going through copies of reports and notes I'd saved over time. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe I just needed to remind myself that I hadn't imagined how much I'd been handling. The more I looked, the more I noticed something unsettling. Several of the projects I had been managing were reassigned the same week I was fired. The timestamps were right there. Quiet handovers I had never been told about. New names attached to files I had built from the ground up. One project in particular stood out. It was marked sensitive, with restricted access. I remembered working on it late at night, double-checking details because something about it hadn't felt right. I had flagged a few concerns back then. Small ones. Easy to overlook. Now, staring at the reassignment date, I realized it had been moved the day before my HR meeting. That didn't feel like restructuring. That felt planned. On the third morning, my phone finally rang. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number, and part of me wasn't ready to talk to anyone from the office yet. But something told me to pick it up. It was a former teammate. Her voice sounded lower than usual, almost careful. "Hey, I hope it's okay," I called. We made small talk at first, both pretending this was a normal conversation. Then she got to the point. "Do you still have any of your notes? On that account you used to manage? The one with all the contract adjustments?" I frowned. "Why?" There was a pause on the other end. I could hear background noise, people talking quietly. "They're asking questions," she said. "About how you tracked everything. No one can find where you kept half of it." I leaned back, trying to process that. "It's all in the system," I said slowly. Another silence. "Yeah," she replied. "That's the problem." Before I could ask what she meant, she added quietly, "They're scrambling over here," and ended the call. Later that afternoon, I got an email notification that made my chest tighten. It was from one of the biggest clients I used to manage directly. For a second, I thought it had been sent by mistake. My company email had already been shut down, so it came through my personal inbox instead. I had given it to them months ago during a late-night project in case anything urgent ever came up. The message was short, but the tone felt off. "Hi Laura, I heard you're no longer handling our account. We weren't informed. Can you clarify what's happening?" I read it twice. They hadn't been told I was gone. I hesitated before replying, trying to keep it professional. I explained that I was no longer with the company and suggested they reach out to my former team for support. I kept it neutral. Careful. A few minutes later, another message came through. "Understood. We've already noticed some inconsistencies in the last report. Just wanted to check if something changed." I stared at that line longer than I should have. Inconsistencies. The word sat heavy in my mind, lingering long after I closed my laptop. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I started scanning industry updates, just out of habit. My company wasn't mentioned often, but sometimes small operational delays or partnership notes showed up in trade newsletters. Most people would overlook them. I never did. Buried halfway down one article was a short mention about temporary delays tied to a department I used to work in. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief note about shifting timelines and internal adjustments. To anyone else, it would have looked normal. But I knew that department rarely missed deadlines. We had built our systems specifically to prevent that from happening. I thought about the process I used to manage quietly in the background. It wasn't flashy, and no one ever really talked about it. But it kept things running smoothly. I checked for errors before they turned into problems. As far as I knew, I was the only one who consistently monitored it. I leaned back, suddenly uneasy. If no one was watching it now, they might not even realize it existed. And if that was true, something small could already be starting to slip. The next morning, I woke up to another message. This one wasn't from a client. It was from someone on my old team I didn't talk to often. The subject line was simple, quick question. Inside, it was even shorter. Do you remember where you saved your tracking notes? We can't find anything. I stared at the screen, confused. All the core information should have been in the system. That's where everything important lived. My notes were just extra. Small reminders. Observations. Things I kept to make my job easier. I replied carefully, explaining that most of what I tracked was built into the workflows themselves. If they followed the steps, the information should appear naturally. A few minutes later, another reply came through. That's the thing, they wrote. We don't know what steps you were taking. I read that line twice. It hadn't occurred to me until that moment that I had built those routines over time, adjusting them quietly whenever I spotted risks. No one had asked. No one had documented it. I had just done it. And now, without those habits in place, they were trying to piece it together. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. I hadn't thought of what I did as anything special. I just noticed patterns quickly. If something looked off, I checked it. If a client sounded unsure, I followed up. If a report didn't match previous numbers, I dug deeper until I understood why. Over time, it became automatic. I remembered staying late some nights to double-check contract details no one else paid attention to. I remembered fixing small discrepancies before they could become bigger issues. I remembered adjusting timelines quietly so clients never felt the pressure building behind the scenes. No one had ever asked how I kept everything so steady. They just assumed it worked. Now I was starting to understand what my old teammate meant. It wasn't that my notes were missing. It was that the way I worked wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in small decisions I made throughout the day. Decisions no one else even noticed. Later that afternoon, I got a message from someone in upper management I barely knew. Hi Laura. I hope you're doing well. Quick question about how you handled risk flags on certain accounts. I stared at the message for a long moment before opening it. It was from someone high up, not my direct boss, not even his manager, but someone above both of them. We had only spoken a handful of times, usually in passing, always polite, always brief. The message itself sounded casual enough. Hi Laura, hope you're doing well. Quick question, can you remind me how you used to track risk flags on certain accounts? Just trying to understand the process. I read it twice. They weren't asking for files. They weren't asking for documentation. They were asking how I thought. I kept my reply neutral, explaining in general terms that I watched for small changes in client behavior, inconsistencies in numbers, delays that didn't match previous patterns. Nothing technical. Nothing detailed. Just enough to answer without stepping into anything complicated. A few minutes passed. Then another message came in. Thank you. We're trying to rebuild that visibility. Rebuild. That word stuck with me. You don't rebuild something unless it's already broken. A few days later, I ran into an old coworker by complete accident. I had stopped at a small cafe near the office, mostly out of habit. I didn't even realize how close I was until I saw a familiar face at the counter. She turned, spotted me, and for a second, her expression shifted from surprise to relief. We sat down for a few minutes, just catching up at first. She looked tired. More tired than I'd ever seen her before. How have things been? I asked carefully. She let out a quiet breath, glancing around before answering. Busy, she said. Really busy. There was a pause, like she was deciding how much to say. Honestly, it's kind of chaotic right now. I didn't push. I didn't need to. She stirred her coffee slowly. A few clients have been asking a lot more questions. Deadlines keep shifting. People are staying late trying to figure things out. I nodded, listening. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, your boss looks stressed. I've never seen him like that before. That was the first time something inside me shifted. That conversation stayed in my mind long after we left the cafe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something hadn't added up in the weeks before I was let go. At the time, everything had felt rushed and confusing. Now, with distance, small details started to stand out more clearly. That night, I opened the last performance review I'd received before being fired. For most of the year, the feedback had been consistent. Strong results. Reliable under pressure. Trusted with high-value accounts. I remembered feeling proud reading it at the time. But toward the end, the tone shifted. There were vague notes about communication alignment and role clarity. Nothing specific. Nothing serious. Just enough to suggest something wasn't quite right. I read those lines again slowly. No one had ever brought those concerns up directly. No meeting. No warning. No conversation to correct anything. Just a few sentences added quietly near the end. And then, a few weeks later, my role was gone. It suddenly felt less like restructuring and more like preparation. The next morning, I got a call from a recruiter. At first, I assumed it was just another routine outreach. Recruiters had been messaging me on and off for years. But something about the way she introduced herself caught my attention. She mentioned my previous role by name. Not just the title, but the specific responsibilities tied to it. We've been hearing about your background, she said. Your old company seems to be asking around about who handled certain functions before. I frowned. What do you mean? Just informal conversations, she replied. Nothing official. But they're trying to understand how some processes were managed. Your name came up more than once. I felt a strange mix of validation and confusion. They replaced me, didn't they? I asked. There was a brief pause on the line. Actually, she said carefully, from what I'm hearing, they haven't filled your role yet. That answer stayed with me long after the call ended. They hadn't replaced me. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. If my role had truly been eliminated, then why were people asking about the work I used to handle? And if the work still existed, why hadn't they hired someone new to take it over? A few days later, I got another message from someone I used to work closely with. It was short and cautious, like the others had been. Hey, quick heads up. One of your old accounts is getting tense. They're asking a lot of questions. I knew exactly which account she meant. It had always required extra attention. Not because it was difficult, but because it was complex. Small details mattered, and if you missed something early, it could snowball fast. I asked what was going on. They're saying numbers don't line up with what they expected, she replied. Nothing huge yet. Just off. I leaned back slowly, thinking. That account had been steady for years. If something was already starting to drift, and no one noticed in time, it wouldn't stay small for long. Later that evening, I opened a folder I hadn't touched since I left. Inside were copies of old project summaries I'd saved for reference over the years. I hadn't thought much about them at the time. They were just personal notes, patterns I'd spotted, reminders of things to watch for, little checkpoints I used to stay ahead of problems. As I scrolled through them, I started to see the bigger picture. There were notes about clients who tended to change direction suddenly. Alerts about contract terms that needed closer review. Warnings I'd written to myself about timelines that could slip if certain approvals were delayed. None of it was official. None of it had ever been requested. I had just learned, over time, where things could quietly go wrong. That's why I checked certain reports twice. Why I followed up on small details others might ignore. I wasn't just doing my job. I had been preventing issues before they had the chance to appear. And now, for the first time, I wondered if anyone even realized how much I'd been holding together. A few days later, another former coworker reached out, this time asking if I had a minute to talk. Her voice was quieter than usual, like she didn't want to be overheard. We spoke briefly, mostly catching up, until she paused and said something that made me sit up a little straighter. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Did you ever feel like you were being watched toward the end?" I frowned. "Watched how?" She hesitated. "Your boss used to ask about your schedule a lot." Not in a normal way. More like he was trying to understand what you were doing all day. Who you spoke to. Which accounts you checked first. I stayed quiet, listening. "At the time, I didn't think much of it," she continued. "But now it feels strange. Like he was trying to map everything you handled." A slow realization settled in. He hadn't just taken credit for my work. He'd been studying it. "Did he say why?" I asked. "No," she said softly. "It just felt planned." That conversation stuck with me more than anything else had. I started replaying small moments in my head. Questions my boss had asked that seemed casual at the time. Times he'd stopped by my desk to ask what I was working on, then stayed just long enough to see my screen. Requests for summaries that felt more detailed than necessary. I had assumed he was just trying to stay informed. Now, it felt different. There had been a few times I pushed back quietly, especially when I noticed shortcuts being suggested. Nothing dramatic. Just small concerns about timing, about making sure everything was reviewed properly before moving forward. I remembered one particular meeting where I'd said, gently, that rushing a certain process could create issues later. He hadn't argued. He just nodded and moved on. But after that, I noticed I wasn't included in discussions about that project anymore. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Now, looking back, it felt like I might have been standing in the way of something without even realizing it. About 2 weeks later, I started hearing things that made the situation feel bigger than just a few stressed coworkers. A message came through from someone who rarely reached out unless something serious was happening. It was brief, almost carefully worded. Internal review happening. Leadership involved now. I read it twice, trying to understand what that really meant. Reviews didn't happen without a reason. Especially not at that level. And they definitely didn't happen quietly. I asked what triggered it. There was a short pause before the reply came back. Multiple issues stacking up. Missed details. Client complaints. Nothing public yet. I felt a strange mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. Part of me was surprised. Another part wasn't. I thought about how many small things I used to check automatically. Things no one noticed because they were handled before they became visible problems. If those same details were slipping now, it would start small at first. A missed number. A delayed approval. A confused client. But over time, small problems didn't stay small. They added up. Later that same week, I received an unexpected email from one of my old clients. This one was different from the earlier messages. It wasn't confused or frustrated. It was appreciative. They thanked me for a process I'd put in place months earlier. At the time, it probably didn't seem like much. Just a small adjustment I'd made to how we tracked certain approvals. But now, they said, it was the only thing keeping one of their projects from falling behind. I read the message slowly, realizing what they were saying. Something I'd set up before I left was still working. Still holding. But if that was the only thing preventing delays on their end, it meant other safeguards might already be failing. At the bottom of the email, they added one more line. "We've noticed some recent changes on your company's side. Just hoping everything is still under control." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Weeks passed, and for the first time since everything happened, life started to feel steady again. The calls and messages from former coworkers slowed down. The questions became less frequent. I began focusing on moving forward, trying to build something new without constantly looking back at what I'd lost. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. Same number. I stared at the screen this time, something about the persistence making my chest tighten slightly. Whoever it was, they really wanted to reach me. It stopped. Then a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't open it right away. I let the phone sit on the table, like picking it up might pull me back into something I wasn't ready to deal with yet. But curiosity eventually won. I pressed play. There was a pause at first. Then a voice I hadn't heard since the day I walked out of the office. "Laura, it's me. I was hoping you could call me back when you have a minute." My stomach dropped. It was my boss. I didn't call back right away. I listened to the voicemail again, trying to read between the lines. His voice sounded different. Slower. Careful. Like he was choosing each word instead of speaking naturally. That alone told me something wasn't right. After a few hours, I finally returned the call. He picked up on the first ring. "Laura," he said, almost too quickly. "Thanks for calling back." There was a brief silence. I waited for him to explain why he'd reached out, but he didn't. Not at first. "How have you been?" he asked, the question sounding strangely formal. "I've been okay," I replied. "What's going on?" Another pause. Then he exhaled, like he'd been holding it in. "I wanted to ask you about something," he said. "About the way you used to track certain risk flags on the accounts you managed." I stayed quiet, listening. "There are a few things we're trying to piece together," he continued. "And, honestly, you're the only one who really understood how it all worked." That was the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit there, giving him space to continue. This was the same man who had barely looked at me the day I packed up my desk, the same man who let HR handle everything without a word. Hearing hesitation in his voice now felt unfamiliar. "What exactly are you trying to figure out?" I asked finally. He paused, like he was deciding how honest to be. "Things have been complicated since you left," he admitted. "Some processes aren't working the way they used to. A few accounts flagged issues we didn't catch early enough. Leadership's asking questions." I leaned back slowly, absorbing what he was saying. "They want to understand how you were tracking everything," he continued. "What you were watching for. Because whatever it was, it kept problems from surfacing." That was the closest he had come to acknowledging what I did. Then his voice lowered slightly. "There's pressure from above now. Reviews. Audits. People trying to figure out where things started slipping." For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about one account or one mistake. Something bigger had started to unravel. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, replaying every part of the conversation in my head. He never said the words directly, but I could hear it in the pauses, in the careful way he spoke. The systems were failing. The same small details I used to catch without thinking were now turning into visible problems. And now leadership wanted answers. Not just about what was going wrong, but about why. I started to understand the truth in a way I hadn't before. I hadn't been fired because I was underperforming. I had been quietly blocking things from moving too fast, asking questions when shortcuts didn't feel right, slowing decisions down just enough to keep everything stable. And maybe that made me inconvenient. Maybe it was easier to remove the person who noticed too much. Now the cracks were showing, and the pressure had shifted back to the people who made those choices. For the first time since I walked out of that building, I realized something had changed. They didn't need to explain anything to me anymore. They needed me.